This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
The Gemara in Pesachim tells a fascinating story. Hahu Arama'ad Havasalak Va'achu Pesachim B'Yerushalayim. There's a guy who used to go up every year to Yerushalayim, and he used to ask and get a portion of the Korban Pesach. And he used to boast afterwards, and he said, "Ksiv kol ben neichel lo yoichal boy, kol orel lo yoichal boy, v'ana haka achilna mishufri shufri." The pasuk says that a guy can't have, an orel can't have, and yet I get from the best. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir, so Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir said to him, "Really, you think you're getting from the best? Mika safulach me'alya? Do they give you from the tail? Tail's the best part, the fattiest part. It's the best part of the carbon." Amalei, he said, "No, they never gave that to me." Kisalkas lahasam, he went the following year. He told him, Kisalkas lahasam, when you go, Eimalahu, tell them, Safuli me'al, you should give me from the tail. Kisalik, when he went up, Amalahu, so he said to him, Me'al Yisafulu, give me from the tail. Amrulei, so he said to him, Alya? L'gavaya salka. The alya goes l'gavaya. That's not something that a person can eat. That goes on the mizbech. It goes for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amrulei. So they said to him, "Ma namalach achi." They have some things here. Who told you that you should ask for this? Amalus, he said to them, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir told me that I should ask for the alya. Amru, my hide. Come on. What's the pshat over here? Badku, so they started doing some research, they looked into him. Badku basrei vashkachu darmahu, found he was a goy, v'katlu, and they killed him. Shalchulei, so they sent a message. The Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir, Shalom lach Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir, peace unto you, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir, da'at ben etzivin, you're in etzivin. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir didn't come up to be either regal, Tais discusses why not. But you are in Netzivin or Mitzudascha Prusa B'Yushalayim, but you have your Mitzuda, you have your net spread out in Yerushalayim, you're able to be mashpia all the way to Yerushalayim as well. We have the Sechiyah, and thanks to Reb Nosson, who facilitated this, thought of it, facilitated everything. As usual, Reish Rishon Shabbat Vedusha, and we have the schia of having Rabbi Glatstein here to be Meir, wake us up in Chodesh Av. And certainly, Rabbi Glatstein, if one would think about this, you could have a person, he certainly doesn't sit only in Woodmere, goes all over the place, but yet the Mitzuda is so far-reaching, four corners of the world, with thousands of Shiurim. And I can tell you myself, it's the first time I have the schia of meeting Rabbi Glatstein, but I've heard so many of his shiurim already over the last few years, and my children as well. We enjoy them with the ne'imus, the chachma, the understanding of human nature, and the geschmackheit. So it's a schia that we have Rabbi Glatstein here, and you should just know that Rabbi Glatstein is mechaber of quite a few Svarim as well. They're on the tables there if one would like to purchase them after the Shiur. And Shekayach, Rabbi Glatstein.
Thank you so much, Rav, for the very warm introduction. It was kedai to come to Muncie just last night to have the good fortune to receive such a warm phone call from the Rav. It's very rare that I speak somewhere and I'm welcomed so warmly. So just that feeling of hiskarvus was kedai to be able to share some divrei Torah. So I appreciate the Rav's welcome. And mevarich the Rav that this Makom Kadosh should be niskadel, should be a Makom shemegadlim by Torah Tefillah, a Makom l'zakis es harabim, and Bez Hashem l'hakim l'adira for many gezunta yaran. The learning tonight is dedicated Lila Nishmas, the Rav's father, Rabbi Aaron Zev Ben Harav Shmuel, Neshama Shavan Aliyah, Shiur Me'el Yosher for the whole mishpacha, for Simchas Anachas Abiyas Gold Tzedek. I want to thank Yedidi Reb Nosson Waldler for, as the Rav said, facilitating the shiur, making all the arrangements. Through the corona, so nobody could go anywhere, but it gives you new opportunities to share Torah. They have different technologies. So I think I probably see Reb Nosson maybe more than his own family, in the morning, Boiker, Tzaharayim, Erev, and thank you so much for making this possible. Actually, this is my first shiur in 3.5 months outside of my office. I mean, in the shiur, but in the 5 towns, they still have the pandemic. It didn't stop yet. We're still... But the truth is, it's a very big madrega to wear a masveh. It's like Moshe Rabbeinu when he came down from the har. It's a mile of kedusha to wear the masveh. But what could you do, But Baruch Hashem, I see that things are coming back to normal over here. And I want to thank Rabbi Aaron Subar, who's manning the camera. And if anybody wants the Mara Makoimos for any of the Shiurim, Rabbi Aaron has been faithfully sending them out for about 10 years now. So you could see Rabbi Aaron to get on the email list. So I want to share with you a very interesting question. We know that Sefer Eicha was written, and the Rav said that some of the people who listen to the shiur, maybe they like the trup a little bit, so you'll forgive me if we get to a pasuk. I feel like I'm among friends, so I think it will be okay. This young man seems that I think he might like it, right? So among friends, we could be a little bit Heimish over here. So the Rambam tells us a very important yesod, because we know that Megillas Eicha is one of the 24 books of Tanakh. And like all the books of Tanakh, it was written at the very least Baruch HaKodesh and possibly B'Nevuah. Who wrote Eicha? Yirmiyahu wrote Eicha. How do we know Yirmiyahu wrote Eicha? The Medrash says that Eicha was written in various stages. First was the Parak Aleph, Beis, and Dalet. Eicha, and Eicha. First, the 3 Eichas were written. And then Yirmiyahu wrote the most tragic Parak of all, which was Parak Gimel, Ani HaGever Ra'ani. And then afterwards, Parak Hey. But this was written all by Yirmiyahu HaNavi. In fact, Rashi says, Ani HaGever Ra'ani. I am the man, Ani HaGever. Rashi says, Ani HaGever is Yirmiyahu. In fact, the Stipler in the Birchas Peretz has the gematria. Ani HaGever is the gematria Yirmiyahu. Ani HaGever is gematria. So they asked the Stipler, you're very into gematria. Should we also try to come up with gematrias? The Stipler said, no, don't spend your time on it. He said, but Rebbe, you have so many gematrias. He says, it just hits me during Kriyas HaTorah. I don't spend it just hits me. So Ani HaGever, very often the Stipler will find that the words of Rashi are gematria, the words of the pasuk. Ani HaGever is gematria Yirmiyahu. Okay. And we've explained in the past that just to understand the pattern of Eicha, Parak Aleph begins with the word Eicha, Parak Beis begins with the word Eicha, Parak Dalet begins with the word Eicha. And they all have 22 psukim and they go according to the letters of the Aleph Beis, but Parak Gimel does not begin with the word Eicha. It begins Ani HaGever, and it has 66 psukim, 3 psukim for every pasuk of the Aleph Beis, and Parak Hey also has 22 psukim, but it doesn't go according to the order of the alphabet of the Aleph Beis. And the Maral explains, this has nothing to do with today's shiur, but I always like to bring in, the Maral explains that the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Kuf Daled says Eicha is gematria 36, because Klal Yisrael violated the 36 Chayavei Krisais. Now, let's think for a moment. During which bayis did they violate the 36 Chayavei Krisais? The Gemara in Yuma says bayis Rishon was destroyed because of Avodah Zarah, Gilei Rayesh, Shvichas Damim. But bayis Sheni, they didn't violate any Chayavei Krisais, but during bayis Sheni, they only violated Sinas Chinam, but the Gemara says Sinas Chinam is equal to the big 3. So the Maral says amazingly, Parak Aleph, Beis, and Dalet is Keneged, the bayis Rishon, Gilei Rayesh, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah. And therefore there is an Eicha, gematria 36, for each one of those 3 cardinal sins, because they violated the biggies. And that's why the psukim in Aleph, Beis, and Dalet are big, because they violated a very big Aveira. But Parak Gimel is connected by Yesheni. And by Yesheni, they did not violate any Aveira that one violation of it is so chamor in and of itself. L'chayra sinas chinam is not really such a chamor avera. There's no einish bidei shamayim. There's no krisus. There's no misas bezdin. There's no even chayvei malchus. It's a lav she'em by maisa. So every violation is a little avera. That's why paragimel, which is connected by yesheni, the psukim are very short. A very short psukim, right? Sometimes there's no even asnachta. Right? Sometimes, how often do you have a pasuk without an asnachta? Paragimel in Eicha, a lot of just a zakev katan. So paragimel is connected by yesheni. By yesheni, they didn't violate chayvei krisus, and therefore it begins on yagever. It doesn't begin with Eicha. Aleph, Beis, and Dalet are connected avodah zarah, gilesh, and shvichas damim. However, Rabbeinu Yoina explains that a small avera, when you repeat it again and again and again and again, it's like a silk thread. When you double it, triple it, quadruple it, it ends up being very wide. So sinas chinam, if you hate a guy, you wake up in the morning, the first thing that enters your mind is, I hate the guy, and then you walk to shul, you hate the guy, and then before Rifa'enu, you hate the guy, and after Rifa'enu, you have a chveis, a little kavana, and obviously during Baruch Aleinu, you're yored demais, of course, so you don't hate. But besides that, you're hating the guy all day long, and every little avera is keneged, it adds up to the big three. Okay, fine. But Yirmiyahu HaNavi wrote Megillas Eicha, and he wrote it, at the very least, Baruch HaKodesh, possibly b'nevuah. Now, Eicha is a very tragic nevuah. Eicha is the most tragic of all the words of the Nevi'im. And yet the Rambam establishes that in order to attain prophecy, a Navi has to be in a certain state of mind. He has to have Yishuv Hadas, he has to have Menuchas HaNefesh, but more than that, the Rambam writes that in order to say nevuah, in order to say prophecy, you can only say nevuah b'simcha. So how in the world did Yirmiyahu HaNavi attain the requisite simcha to be able to prophesy the nevuah of Eicha, so that Eicha could be, the English, canonized as one of the 24 books of Tanakh? That's the kasha. If you look in the Rambam, Kol HaNevi'im ein misnavim b'chol eisha yirtzu. Nevi'im cannot prophesy whenever they want. Ela mechavnim daitam, they focus their mind. V'yoshvim smeichem etuvei lev, they sit happy, good-hearted. Umezboidedin, they go into contemplation. She'ein hanavua shoyra lo mitoich atzvus v'lo mitoich atzvus ela mitoich simcha. If you want to be a prophet, you know why they don't learn Navi in the yeshivas, right? Because it's a non-for-profit organization. But if you want to be a prophet, you have to be besimcha, you have to be happy. So how did Yirmiyahu HaNavi acquire the requisite simcha to be able to say nevuah? Asks the Yad HaMelech. The Yad HaMelech was the grandson of the Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer Landau, and he wants to know, the Rambam, based on the Gemara in Shabbos, teaches us that a Navi cannot say nevuah b'shivroin lev uva'atzva ruach, and therefore how did Yirmiyah say nevuah? In fact, ask the Yad HaMelech a very interesting thing. One of the old Polish Gaonim, my great-great-grandfather was a Talmud of Rabbi Shmuel Mikutna. In fact, he helped publish the Yeshuas Malka of Rabbi Shmuel Mikutna, and Rabbi Shmuel Mikutna has a purest on the Rambam, and he says, interestingly, if you notice, so many of the perushim of the Rambam on the Rambam have the word melech in it, king. Why? Yad HaMelech, Mishnah Lamech, a lot of perushim that the word. Why melech? He says Rabbi Shmuel Mikutna because the Rambam was a gilgul of Shmuel the Amoira, Ravu Shmuel the Amoira. And Shmuel in the Gemara is called Malka, and since the Rambam was a Melech, Hashkocha had it, that many of the Perushim of the Rambam are called something Melech. Half of a fel. Anyway, the Yad HaMelech asks, in order to say Nevuah, you have to be Besimcha. You can't have any deficiency. So the Yad HaMelech says something very interesting. Yad HaMelech says that even a physical deficiency would be an impediment to say Nevuah. In fact, the Gemara asks, how could Moshe Rabbeinu say nevuah, but he was a kvad pel, kvad lashain? So from here we see that in order to say nevuah, you have to be a gibar, you have to be a chacham, you cannot have even physical deficiency. And the answer is, says the Yad HaMelech, Moshe's stutter, Moshe's speech impediment was not a physical deficiency. It was b'hashgacha that he should be a kvad peh or kvad lashon. And in the past we've quoted from the Ran. The Ran explains that Hashem designated Moshe Rabbeinu as a poor speaker, lest you don't make a mistake. You might think that, you know why Klal Yisrael would mekabel the Torah? Because Moshe Rabbeinu was such a smooth talker. He could sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. So he sold you all kinds of things, like he said you can't eat chametz on Pesach, and he convinced you. He said you can't talk by Chazar Sashatz, and you can't bring cell phones into the Beis Medrash, and you have to sit in a sukkah on Sukkot. All the big chamurim, all these big things. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to persuade Klal Yisrael, even though we wouldn't have done it. It's only because Moshe Rabbeinu was such a smooth talker. So Hashem made Moshe Rabbeinu a stammerer and a stutterer, so that we would understand and recognize that we were makabel the Torah based on its content and not based on Moshe Rabbeinu's speaking ability. So Moshe Rabbeinu's speech impediment was not a physical deficiency, but rather was b'hashgacha pratis. Says the Yad HaMelech, and I'm going to just take you on a little detour, because this is a very interesting question. How could Yirmiyahu HaNavi say this prophecy? L'chayra, he said it in a state of great atzvos. I mean, he says, "B'cha'isiv keheb alayla," right? Kumi roini bala, right? Shivchi chamayim libech. I mean, these psukim, how could you read them and not be nisoira and nisragesh? How could Yirmiyah say this psukim if he was a l'chayra in a state of atzvos? Now, this is such an interesting question that last year, this time, Rabbi Aaron, where were we this time last year? About a week from today, we were actually in Frankfurt. And we were in Frankfurt, and a Yid came in, and this Yid handed me a sefer. So the Yid had a long beard. I figured, he must have been on our trip, because either you were German or you were on our trip over there. And he handed me a sefer, and this sefer was the commentary of the Ben Ish Chai on Eicha. And he gave me a little heads up, Rabbi Rafael Ansel from France. So I had to go to Germany to get a sefer from France to give the Shiur in Muncie. And this sefer really opened up a whole new understanding of Megillas Eicha. But it was also brought to my attention that this question that we're asking is not only the question of the Yad HaMelech, but the Chazoin Ish also has this question. The Chazoin Ish almost is baffled by this question. Now, we're in the Chazoin Ish, where the Chazoin Ish asks a question on Eicha. So it's interesting, in the Sharei Aron, the Sharei Aron on Chumash, he has a chilek on Orach Chaim, and the chilek on Orach Chaim, he has little hagois and ha'aras from the Chazoin Ish, questions he asks the Chazoin Ish. And one of the things he has over here, all the way at the end, at number 31, Rabbeinu Shoal, Haloi Kishe Yirmiyahu Amar Asakinus, Haloi Betach Bocha in Afugos. For sure he was crying incessantly. Uchamosh Amar Ba'atzmo, Eini Nigrav Loi Tidme Me'ein Afugos. Yirmiyah says, I'm crying without any respite. But Eicha was Nischaber B'Nevuah, and Ein Ashchina Shoira, let me talk Simcha. Mar Rabbi say, you know who else asked this question? The Yismach Moshe in this week's Parsha, Parshas Va'aschana. Now I have a very interesting kesher to the Yismach Moshe. What's my kesher? You know this already? You heard too many Shiurim. You do also how? Your great uncle. Now watch this. He's not my great, but my grandmother, Aleh Shalom, was the daughter of the last Rav of Sachachav. And during the Holocaust, she was running in the forests, and she was together with a woman by the name of Mrs. Natan Zan, who is a descendant of the Shalom Eshev, and also a descendant of the Yismach Moshe. In fact, she had the Yismach Moshe's gartel. And not only that, she has the Yismach Moshe's gartel. And she told her son that at her levaya, he should put on the gartel, which he did. And if anybody knows someone who wants to buy it, it's available now. But anyway, so that's my connection to the Yismach Moshe. My grandmother was fleeing with the gartel of the Yismach Moshe. Okay, that's pretty good, right? So The Yismach Moshe wants to know in Parshas V'aschanan, he says, Kashali, about on the 7th line, Kashali kusha atzuma, deha Megillas Eicha meklal aksuvim, v'kaimalon dechal aksuvim, Baruch HaKodesh. Now, at the very least, if it's part of ksuvim, even if it's not been a vuah, it's at the very least Baruch HaKodesh. And in the Bala Ikrim, he also asks, Yirmiyahu was a Navi. And so the gist of the answer is that maybe Eicha was not written B'Nevuah, maybe it was only written Baruch HaKodesh, but says the Yismach Moshe, so what? Even if it was written Baruch HaKodesh, Ein Hashchina Shoira, Lo'imitoich Atzvos. And says the Yismach Moshe, you should know, this is not only my question, you know who else asked the question? The Rebbe, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, he also asked this question. How could Yirmiyahu write Sefer Eicha? He certainly was crying, he certainly was full of sorrow and morose. How could he write Megillas Eicha? Hinei achar kama shamim shenaskashesi bezeh, says the Yismach Moshe, Bali Yadi Sefer Yaros Tavash, from Hagon Rabbi Yonasan, V'roisi Shegam, who Amar al Kusha Zu V'simachti, I was so happy. So it's not only the Yad HaMelech, and it's not only the Chazon Ish, it's not only the Yismach Moshe, the Rebbe Rabbi Yonasan, everybody wants to know, how did Yirmiyahu write the book? So comes the Yad HaMelech and he says as follows. The reason why, if somebody is sad, they can't have Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah is because sadness is a human deficiency. How is it a deficiency? It's the inability to deal with the challenges that a person faces in life. Now sometimes it's very hard not to be sad. There are difficulties in life that make a person sad. And it's very difficult sometimes to be b'simcha. You should know that there are Gedolei Yisrael, Asher mipihem anu chayin, that we learn their svarim every single day, that write openly they suffered from depression. I'm not going to say who, but it's Yadua U'Meforsam, Mamish, the biggest Go'inim of 100 years ago. Such a thing. Sometimes a person's not able to deal with the difficulties of life. It's not always a deficiency, sometimes it is, but you can't be a Navi. In other words, think of it this way, the Gevura that is needed to be a Navi is so powerful. You have to be able to overcome every challenge in life, always to be in the proper frame of mind. But sometimes sadness is not a human deficiency. There are times a person could cry from joy. One time in my life, I cried from joy. I don't have to tell you everything, every personal thing during this year, right? One time, Rabbi Akiva would cry even on Shabbos, right? Because it was an oineg loi. So it's shayach that bechiyos could be not from human deficiency, but a sign of greatness. When Yirmiyahu was crying as he wrote Sefer Eicha, says the Yad HaMelech, was that a cry? Were those tears of human deficiency, the inability to deal with the vicissitudes of life? Or were those tears that emanating from his neshama because he felt the tsar of the churban and the tsar of the shechina and the tsar of other yidden? These were not tears of human deficiency, says the Yad HaMelech. These were tears of gadlus. This didn't demonstrate atzlus or atzvos, but rather this emanated from the gadlus of the neshama of Yirmiyahu, and therefore the fact that he was sad in no way precluded him from being b'nevuah and Baruch HaKodesh. But friends, today we're going to offer a different approach to this question of how is it possible that Yirmiyahu HaNavi said this prophecy, even though l'chayra, as the Chazon Ish says, he was crying, me'ein hafugais. Let's begin with the following question. When did Yirmiyahu say the nevuah of Eicha? So that's a shayla in the Medrash. Number 3, Ve'emasai Nemra, Megillas Kinos, Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, Bimei Yehoyakim Nemra, it was said in the days of Yehoyakim. Now Yehoyakim was the king prior to the Churban. That means Yirmiyahu said the prophecy of doom and gloom before it happened. How would it seem if you go into someone's hospital room and you start weeping, and the guy says, "What are you crying about?" You say, "I'm crying because you're going to die." Now, azab bikur chaylim. It's mamish bikur chaylim and kvuras hameis b'sha achas, right? You can't cry before the person is dead. So why would Yirmiyahu say Eicha before the Mikdash was destroyed? And therefore the Medrash concludes, Elaima Sainemra, Achar Churban Abayis. It was after the Churban, because how could you say Lamentations before it happened? That's the Medrash. Frek the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai wrote a wondrous parish on the Megillah called Nechamas Tzion. And in his Hakdama, he begins with this question. If you look in the Gemara Maggid Katan, the Gemara Maggid Katan wants to know when was Megillas Eicha said. And the Gemara says, Yirmiyahu said Eicha to Yehoyakim. They said to Yehoyakim, do you understand what's happening? Eicha Yashva Badad Yishraim will sit desolate. And Yehoyakim says, who cares? I'm the Melech. And they told Yehoyakim, what do you mean? Balcha Yisifke Balayla. Yerushalayim will cry bitterly at night. And Yehoyakim says, who cares? I'm still the king. And they told Yehoyakim, Golsa Yehuda Me'oini, Klal Yisrael will be exiled. And Yehoyakim says, who cares? Darchet Tzion Avelois. Yehoyakim says, I don't care. And then they told Yehoyakim, Hayehut Sareha Lerai Shayeveha Shalu. They said, Yehoyakim, the enemy will be the leader and you're out of here. Yehoyakim says, Achan Vai, I'm not going to be the king anymore. And he commands to tear the shame of Hashem out of Sefer Eicha. But what do we see from the Gemara in Maggid Katan? When was Eicha written? The Gemara does not bring any opinion that it was written after. The Gemara conclusively seems to say that Eicha was written before the story, and yet the Medrash attempts to say that Eicha was written before it happened, but the Medrash had a kasha, is it possible to cry before someone dies? And the Medrash concludes, no, it had to have been said after. So how will the Gemara answer the kasha of the Medrash? You can't cry about something before it happened. So the Ben Ish Chai offers the following revolutionary twist to understand Megillas Eicha. The Ben Ish Chai quotes the pasuk in Chavakuk. Beroiges rachim tiskar, where the Rebbeinu Shalom says, Beroiges, in your anger, rachim tiskar, you have mercy on Klal Yisrael. Which literally means, even when Hashem gets angry at us, He has mercy on us even at that time. However, the Ben Ish Chai has a deeper interpretation. Beroiges, in the angry words of Hashem, Rachim Tizkar, He's really speaking Rachamim. If you look carefully at the Divrei Peranios, at the Divrei Oynesh, at the Klolos, at the Toichacha, if you look carefully at the words, you'll uncover that they're really words of Nechama. And it's this principle with which the Ben Ish Chai bases his commentary on Megillas Eicha, where the Ben Ish Chai says, you could look at the pasuk, and the pasuk seems to be saying words of Peranios and words of Einshim, and yet, if you look carefully, they are really words of consolation and words of Nechama. In fact, the Ben Ish Chai was not the first to read Eicha this way, but even Kadmoinim already have interpreted Eicha this way. So, for example, if you look at number 34, there is a Perush on Eicha called Aloin Bachus by Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Vital. And Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Vital has two Perushim on Eicha. One, B'derech HaPshat, but then he has another Pshat where the entire Megillah is really Divrei Nechama and words of consolation and prophecy for the future and the good of Klal Yisrael. And as the Ben Ish Chai himself says, Rav Galanti, one of the early Mikubalim, also interpreted Eicha this way. Says the Ben Ish Chai, if you read Eicha with a little bit of a twist, and you read Eicha in this way, we could understand how Yirmiyahu wrote Eicha before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, because it was not necessarily intended to be a prophecy of doom and gloom. It was going to be, or could have been, or it is also a prophecy of nechama and consolation for Klal Yisrael. And with this approach, perhaps we will be able to shed new light on how it was possible for Yirmiyahu to write this Nevuah Baruch HaKodesh. But the Ben Ish Chai directs our attention to a number of Mamorei Chazal. For instance, if you take a look, in number 6, the Ben Ish Chai quotes the Zohar Chadash. And the Zohar teaches us in Parshas Kiseitze, Kol haftachos v'nachamos di Yisrael bahani klalois ksivi. If you want to know where are the promises of good news, where are the consolations for Klal Yisrael, they are found in the Toichacha. If you look in the Teichacha, you could find all the nechama and all the bracha for Klal Yisrael. Because after all, take the word sinas chinam. A friend of mine just sent me today, Rabbi Avi Feiner, he said, chinam is also nachem. So even the letters have already been given in a situation where with a little bit of a reading, a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a knetch, they can have what is called, says the Ben Ish Chai, milsa de mesamra l'trei api. It can have another meaning as well. So let's begin, and I'll give you a little bit of a flavor to some of the different perspectives that the Ben Ish Chai gives on a number of the first early psukim on Eicha. And Be'ezus Hashem, we hope that this year that will be the true way to read the Megillah, as we see that the Kedushas Levi writes that La'asad Lavai, when we read Eicha, we're going to read it with a Shechianu. Now, interesting, Shechianu. Shechianu is a bracha you say when you do something, a mitzvah b'simcha. But Be'ezus Hashem, when Mashiach comes, Eicha will be a Megillah that we're going to read with great joy and great simcha. Eicha yashva badad, alas, she sits in solitude. She's all alone. Literally, it seems to be saying Yerushalayim will be desolate, will be lonely, will be all by herself. But says the Ben Ish Chai, based on the Dubna Maggid, we know the pasuk says in Parshas Balak, Hinam levadad yishgain, Klal Yisrael dwells alone. And that was a compliment, that was an accolade that Bilam is giving Klal Yisrael. I'm in number 11. What did Bilam mean, Hinam levadad yishgain? Says the Dubna Maggid, you know, if you're a teacher or you're a Rebbe, there are two ways of giving a test. One way to give a test is, this kid gets 100, and this kid gives a 90, and this kid gets an 80. And objectively, everybody gets what they get. But then, you could give a test where the lowest mark is a 30, and the highest mark is a 60, so the 60 is 100, and the 30 is 70, and everyone is marked on a curve. So there, people are not judged independently and inherently, they're judged vis-a-vis, they're judged relative. The Yeshuas Yaakov writes, that's why Klal Yisrael has two names, Yaakov and Yisrael. Yisrael is Klal Yisrael when we're looked at ideally by ourselves, without being compared to the nations of the world. Klal Yisrael could sometimes be on the Madrega of Yisrael, where we're inherently on a high Madrega. But sometimes we're not inherently on a high Madrega. So Hashem has to cut us some slack. So then there's another bechina of how Hashem looks at us, and He says, look, Yaakov was being held, right? Esav was holding on to the heel of Yaakov. So that is comparing Klal Yisrael to Esav. Now we might not be on such a high madrega, but vis-a-vis Esav, we're pretty good. So too like this. There are times in our history where the Rebbeinu Shalom looks at us and the Rebbeinu Shalom says, look, Klal Yisrael, I don't even have to see and look at what the Ummah Yisrael are doing. You're independently, you're inherently on a high madrega. And sometimes Hashem says, you guys are lousy, but compared to the Goyim, you're tzaddikim gemurim. Heinam levadad yishkain. Bilam is saying that Klal Yisrael is on the madrega levadad. Hashem does not have to compare us to the nations of the world, to compare us to Esav, to compare us to Yishmael. We're levadad, we're inherently great. Says the Dubna Maggid, says the Ben Ish Chai in a similar vein. Eicha yashva vadad. Alas, she sits in solitude. You have different kinds of cities. Let's talk about New York. New York is a great city. Or at least it used to be a great city when they had police. Okay, fine. But there are a lot of good things in New York. What's good about New York? They have good commerce, and there are a lot of stores. Yeah, but what if you need corn? Corn, you get it in Kentucky. And what if you need oil? Okay, you get it in Saudi Arabia. So what does New York have? New York still has a lot of things. It's just that it's dependent on many other states and countries. But imagine if you had a country or a city that is completely independent and completely self-sufficient. That if it needs corn grows in the city. And if it needs oil, there are oil deposits in the city. And if it needs salt, you can mine salt from that city. There's no city in the world like that. Hashem made it that every city needs the other. Now, it doesn't mean New York is not a great city. And certainly not Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a great city, even though it may be dependent on many, many other Mekayimais. Eicha, is it Shayach? This is talking about it. Bizman Shabeis HaMikdash Kayam. It's talking about lost in Lavai when Mashiach comes. Yashva Vadad, Yerushalayim is all by herself. She doesn't need the Middle East for oil, and she doesn't need corn from Oklahoma, and she doesn't need any other imports. Everything Yerushalayim could possibly want is found in Yerushalayim. It's the greatest shvach. There's no city in the world that was ever like Yerushalayim. She's badad, she's self-sufficient. So you say, big deal, maybe because nobody lives there. There are a few people that live there and they have whatever they need. No! Rabbasiyam! There's so many people that live there and they're still so self-sufficient. So you say, okay, it's only a lot of people. It's not like teeming. No, there's so many people. Ke'al mana. It's like you can't count them. Al mana. You cannot believe mania. You can't count them, says the Ben Ish Chai. Now, what is something that is al mana that you can't count? There are two things you can't count. The stars and the sand. That's what the Rebbeinu Shalom promised Avram Avinu. You cannot count. You're going to be so many Yidden that you can't count this, like the sand and the stars. That's the prophecy of Hoisa Ke'al Mana, says the Ben Ish Chai. Rabbasi Bagoyim, there's so many of us. So you say, okay, not bad for the first pasuk. What's the Ben Ish Chai going to do with the second pasuk? I mean, this seems like impossible. She cries bitterly at night. Her tear is on her cheek. She has no consolation. I mean, you could spin this, twist this, so what are you going to do with this pasuk? Says Ben Ish Chai very pashut. We know they're the forces of Kedusha and the forces of Tumah. And the Zohar HaKadosh writes in Parshas Eicha that Friday night when you come home, you have to realize that there are forces of Kedusha, and the forces of Kedusha are the mistress, Shabbos. You have to treat Shabbos very well, the Zohar says. You have to give Shabbos light and delights and good clothing and good food to make the mistress of Shabbos rejoice, because when the mistress of Shabbos rejoices, then the bad Isha, which is the kayach of Tumah, which dominates the light, the nighttime, which we don't usually say, but L'tachlis Halimud, to be familiar, the name of it is Lilis, who dominates the nighttime. She starts to cry Friday night. If you come home Friday night and then the table is set and everyone is acting in a proper manner and you're giving joy to the mistress of Shabbos, and all of a sudden this Kayach HaTumah, she's crying, she's wailing, she's moaning, she's weeping, she cannot be consoled. So says the Ben Ish Chai, Pasuk Aleph is talking about the Kayach HaKedusha of Yerushalayim, Bimei Tanchumeha, and Pasuk Beis is talking about the Kayach HaTumah. You know how the Kayach HaTumah feels when Yerushalayim is B'yoifya and B'tifarta? B'chai Sivke Balayla, the Kayach HaTumah is crying at night. B'dimas Alech Ein La Menachem, nobody could console her. She doesn't know what to do. She calls the United Nations, console me. The United Nations said, we're out of business. We can never do anything anyway. We were empty to begin with. And she calls the Chveis, NATO, and all these other empty world organizations, and nothing doing. Golsa Yehudi Me'oini Me'roi V'avoida Pasuk Gimel. Literally, Golsa Yehuda Me'oini. Yehuda was exiled out of her poverty, but says the Ben Ish Chai, the word Golsa could also be a lashon of Giloi, like when Bathsheba says to David, why are you dancing up and down by the Chanukas Habayis, Ki Golois Niglois Achar Arekim? Why are you revealing yourself? Why are you uncovering yourself? Golsa Yehuda. You know how the greatness and the beauty and the majesty and the grandeur of Klal Yisrael will be revealed? Me'oini, because of the many, many centuries of affliction that we had to undergo and we had to endure, and yet we did not move away a kol shehu, not from a mitzvah in the Torah, not from a drabbanon, not from a minhag. With all the travails and all the suffering and all the vicissitudes, that showed the real beauty of Klal Yisrael. He yashva b'goyim. Klal Yisrael could live among the goyim. We could be living in America. And still, loimatza manoyach, and our leisure never became like the leisure of the goyim. We never find the same rest that the goyim find. We don't have to barbecue 3 days in a row every weekend just because the goyim do. We don't find the same pleasures in life that the goyim do. That shows the real beauty of Klal Yisrael. Koroid fel hisigua. All of her pursuers try to catch up with her. But Bein HaMitzarim, Klal Yisrael is always wedged firmly and securely between the Mitzarim of the Dinei D'Rabbanan that the Klal Yisrael have accepted upon themselves. Pasuk Daled. Darchei Tzion Avelos. Literally, the roads of Tzion are mourning. Darchei Tzion Avelos. You know, what are you going to do with that pasuk? Says the Ben Ish Chai, no problem. Look in the pasuk in Shoftim, in number 18. Nachal Kishain Gerafam, the river of Kishain, swept them away. Nachal Kedumim, Nachal Kishain, Tidrechi, Darach, to trample. Darchei Tzion, those who in the past have trampled Tzion. Avelos, they're mourning. They're mourning. They realize their whole existence was futile. Mebli bai mayed. Nobody's coming to these countries anymore. All these big hotspots that for 2,000 years everybody visited, nobody's interested anymore. There's only one country everyone's interested in. They're Avelos, Koyaneh, their clergy. The Noitzrim, the Yishmaelim, not Kohanim, not our Kohanim. Their Kohanim. Ne'enochim. The whole world is desolate. They realize their whole existence was empty. Hayut Sareha L'Rosh. The enemy, what does L'Rosh mean? So Pashav L'Rosh, our enemy will be our leader. But remember from the Teichacha, Penyesh bachem shoyresh poire roish v'la'ana. Maybe there'll be in you a root of gall, of wormwood. Says the Ben Ish Chai on the pasuk number 20. Hayu tsareha l'roish. The enemy is being fed bitterness. All the bitterness that belonged to us for 2,000 years. Don't think the Rebbeinu Shalom forgot about one tragedy. 1 ounce of bitterness, 1 sorrow, 1 pogrom, 1 difficulty. All of that gall and all of that wormwood, the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to feed the Umayis Ha'olam, and the Chafetz Chaim writes in his Akdama. Hashem is going to take the Sonei Yisrael. He's going to punish them so much, they're going to cease to exist. So they're going to say, okay, now we're patur because we don't exist anymore. Hashem is going to reconstitute their molecules to give them more kayach, to be able to be soivel, more yisurim for everything they did to us. Hayut sareh l'rosh, they're going to be full of gall. Ayaveha shalu. The enemy will draw, milashon hashoyle dog min hayam. The enemy is going to draw all of our bitterness away from us. So you say, okay, now we're stumped. There's no way to explain the end of this pasuk. Oilaleha halchu shavi lifnei tsar. Her children walk in captivity before the enemy. What are you going to say with that pasuk? Simply, the pasuk is saying the Jewish children are going to be led away in captivity by the enemy. Says the Ben Ish Chai, no. The Gentiles are going to have such a moira from Klal Yisrael. They're going to be so insecure. We're going to have the fear of God is going to be making them shudder to such an extent that we're going to be sending our little babies to march off in front of the enemy. And they're going to be so scared of us that they won't even be able to look at it. That's how powerful we're going to be. Oylaleh, Yiddish kinderlach are going to walk before the enemy, and they're going to be secure because the nations of the world are going to be so insecure and so frightened from us. Now this is the best one. You ready for this? Number 25. Vayetzei mi basiya in kol hadara. Literally, and from Tzion went out all of her glory. Seems like all beauty, all majesty, all glory will leave Tzion. How are we going to explain this pasuk? Says the Ben Ish Chai very pashat. You know, we live in a world where we get used to things that don't really make so much sense. Oh, it's amazing, Torah in America. You know how many Talmidim are in Lakewood, New Jersey? How many Talmidim? I don't know, 5,000? And we think this is a normal thing. Kimi, New Jersey, Teitzei Torah. That's how it's supposed to be, you know. And in Skver, how many Bachrim in the yeshivas? A lot, many. Almana, right? Can't even count them. And we think, you know, that's Torah in America. Ki mi America teitzei Torah, says the Ben Ish Chai. That's not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be the Torah comes from Yerushalayim. This is a product, this is a repercussion of the Golos, that Torah, that not all the Torah in the world comes from Yerushalayim. But when Mashiach comes, it's going to be Vayetze mibas Sion kol hadara. You're not going to have yeshivas here and there, in this country, in Chutz La'aretz, and in this city. All the Torah in the world will come from Tzion. It will be Kimi Tzion Teitzei Torah. That's what it means. Vayetze mibas Tzion kol hadara. All the glory will come from Tzion. Hayu sareha ka'ayalim laimatzu mireh. Her princes, the Rabbanim, will be like gazelles that can't find pasture. How could this be good? Says the Ben Ish Chai, don't you know? What's the job of a Rav? The job of a Rav, kisifsei koyen yishmeru das. The Rav has to teach Torah. To who? To those who don't know it yet. But when Mashiach comes, it's going to be kikulam yaidu oisi mekatim. Everyone's going to know the Rebbeinu Shalom. So Rabbanim are not going to have anything to do. So this is a haftacha l'toiva. Hayu sareh ka'ayalim leimot. They're not going to find pasture. They're not going to have people to teach. In fact, the Chassam Sofer is very busy with this question. Chassam Sofer is very worried. What are Rabbanim going to do when Mashiach comes? I don't know. They're going to relax. You know. No, what are they going to do? The Chassam Sofer wants to know. Who are they going to teach? So Chassam Sofer says they're going to teach Malachei Hasharis. They're going to teach the Malachim. But that's what the pasuk is saying. Hayu sareha ka'ayalim laimatzu mireh. So one after another, the Ben Ish Chai has a very subtle way to just reinterpret the pasuk, that the pasuk is not said l'ra, it's not a perennius, but instead the pasuk is a haftacha and a promise l'toiva. And finally, the last offering for tonight, on pasuk Zayin, Zachra Yerushalayim Yimei Anya Merudeha. That the time will come that we're going to send an invoice to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're going to say, Rebbeinu Shalom, let's make a cheshbon over here. For how many years did the Beis HaMikdash stand? 410 Bayis Rishon, 420 Bayis Sheni. And for how many years were we in Golos? We're in Golos 2,000 years. Okay, Rebbeinu Shalom, you owe us. You owe us. Furthermore, how did we fare during the times that the Beis HaMikdash stood? It was good times. How did we fare during the Galus? It was shreklach. Rebbeinu Shalom, we're not moichel the Ummos Ha'olam. We need you to pay back the Ummos Ha'olam for every last thing they did to us. We need you to even up the score. Samchenu kimaisi nisanu. So the pasuk says, Zachra Yerushalayim Yimei Anya Merudeha. So the nations of the world come in and they say, look, what do you want from us? So the nations will look. Germany, okay, fine. They did something bad for 5 years. And France, they did something bad, in the 11th century. And the nations are going to start wiggling out. We weren't so bad. It's just this country, and Spain did something in 1492. And America's going to say, look, we were wonderful to the Jews. We didn't do anything wrong. And therefore the pasuk says, no. B'nefoil ama b'yad sar. Whenever we fell to the enemy, ve'ein oizer la. Nobody ever helped us out. When the Germans were gassing Jews in the early 40s, and Franklin Roosevelt knew what was happening, and instead of bombing Auschwitz, he bombed near Auschwitz, Rebbeinu Shalom says, I didn't forget about that. America is not off the hook. Jewish blood is on the conscience and on the hands of the United States of America. Don't think only the nations that perpetrated the evil will be punished when Mashiach comes. No, the Yirmiyahu HaNavi is saying, "B'nafal ama b'yad zar," when Klal Yisrael fell to the enemy, "Ve'ein oizer lo," nobody helped us. They could have helped us. They made believe they didn't know about it, but they knew full well. They could have stopped it. They could have saved millions of Jews. So they're all responsible, and this is an invoice that Klal Yisrael is going to come to the Rebbeinu Shalom and is going to say, "Rebbeinu Shalom, you need to pay back the nations of the world, and we want you to pay us l'toiva, samachenu k'moisi nisanu." So is it possible, can we suggest that to answer the question of the Yad HaMelech, and the Chazon Ish, and the Yismach Moshe, and the Rebbe Rabbi Yonasan, that how could Yirmiyahu HaNavi write this nevuah? Wasn't he wailing bitter tears? Wasn't he crying? You can't say nevuah mitoich atzvos. Is it possible that at the time that Yirmiyah wrote this nevuah, because after all, according to Shas Bavli, when did Yirmiyah write the nevuah? He wrote it before it happened. But doesn't the Medrash say, Eich boichin ala meisad shalayamos? So what does Shas say to the question of the Medrash? You have to say Shas holds that Yirmiyah was writing it before it happened, because he was not writing it as the Bechia ala mei shalayamos. He was writing it lefi the other interpretation. Now certainly it also has this connotation. Ein mikro yotzei midei pshuta, but in terms of how Yirmiyah was able to access the Ruach HaKadusha, the spirit of Nevuah, the spirit of Ruach HaKodesh, is it possible that Yirmiyah was able to access Nevuah because in fact he was able to prophesy Megillas Eicha mitoich simcha atzuma of the Yeshuais and the Nechamais that, if you look carefully, you're able to detect in Megillas Eicha. And Marv Rabbi say, if in even psukim of Peronios and Oinshem, the words are saying Nechama, Beroiges Rachim Tizkar, then certainly as well during the Oinesh and during the difficulty, if you'd be able to sort of go a little deeper and uncover a little bit, you'd be able to see and feel and recognize that even the Oinesh itself has that Nechama, Bracha, and Yeshua in the Oinesh itself. And that's also part of Beroiges Rachim Tizkar. And as we're coming out of this period of really world history, of the last 4 months that Klal Yisrael endured and the whole world endured, and I'm sure it's been a difficult time for many people, if not for everybody. And at first glance, it seems like this has been months of mamish eicha yashva badad, whether physically, in Yonei Refuah, in Yonei Parnasa, many people have been affected very profoundly in many ways. But we have to understand that Beroiges Rachim Tizkar, in what seems to be the anger of Hashem, if we dig a little deeper, we'll recognize that perhaps these were the best months of our life. How? Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't see it, but we certainly have an emunah that to a very great extent, everything the Rebbeinu Shalom brings upon us is really midas harachamim and midas hachesed. In fact, the Kedushas Levi says that when Mashiach comes, we're going to lane Megillas Eicha with the Shechiyanu. It's very interesting. In the Parsha, in Parshas Kisavai, right before the Teichacha, it says the Parsha Vidoi Meiser, and the person says, Lo yachalti va'oni mimenu, v'loi, what? Rashi says that a person is moideh, that he made the brachos. Rashi says this is a haidah, that a person was mavarich. So the Achronim ask, what do you mean this is a haidah, that a person was mavarich? Think about it. This is vidoi meiser, this is a pasuk in the Chumash. If it's a pasuk in the Chumash, the person is being moideh that he made a bracha. Brachas are only d'Rabbanan. How could you be misvadeh that you made a bracha? Brachas are only d'Rabbanan. So the Shem Mishmo writes that even though brachas are d'Rabbanan, there is one bracha that is a doiraisa. Which bracha is doiraisa? Shechiyanu. Why? Because since there's a chiyuv to serve Hashem b'simcha, tachas Hashem elikach b'simcha, the Rimegash says the bracha of Shechayanu is a bracha d'oraisa, and it's learned out from the pasuk tachas Hashem elikach b'simcha. So Mashiach comes, we're going to make a bracha on Eicha, but not just Asher Kedushan Mitzvah Tzivanu Likroi Megillah. We're going to make a Shechayanu. And that Shechayanu is going to be a Shechayanu da'iraisa, because it's going to be an expression of reading Megillas Eicha with great simcha, praising the godless of Yerushalayim, that she's Yashva Badad, that she's self-sufficient, that she's not dependent on any other city, that all the Torah in the world will be emanating from Yerushalayim. Vayetzeh mibat Zion kol hadara, Golsa Yehudi, and the real greatness of Klal Yisrael will be revealed after our sterling record of 2,000 years of avodas Hashem mitoich oini and mitoich galas. So perhaps this would give us a perspective of how Yirmiyahu HaNavi, the Navi who was born on Tisha B'Av, Yirmiyahu cursed the day he was born, but still he was able to say this nevuah mitoich simcha shel mitzvah, because there is another hidden dimension of Megillas Eicha, and it's really a hidden dimension of life in general. And we should taka bizoicha to be able to see in our own lives the sweet way of looking at it and understanding it. And Be'ezus Hashem, we should be zoicha to the time when Megillas Eicha will be read as Divrei Nechama and Divrei Yeshua. We should be zoicha that Soim HaChamishi Yiyah LeBeis Yehuda L'sasoin L'simcha L'mayadim Toivim V'ha'emes V'ashalom Ehavu. Thank you so much, and have an easy time. Shkayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.